Bueno, ahora les quiero presentar a Ben, que si no lo conocen, se van a hacer fans a partir de ahora también, así como ya hicieron de Ryan. Ben Welsh es periodista y programador, es data producer en Los Angeles Times, ya lo venimos siguiendo hace un par de años, somos sus fans. Y bueno, este año fueron finalistas también con nosotros de los Data Journalism Awards. Los venimos siguiendo desde el 2009, más o menos, lo que están haciendo con datos. Van mucho a la conferencia de NICAR, donde es un activo participante. Y es un gran referente en Estados Unidos, por supuesto, y de la comunidad internacional, que no es muy grande, así que es un lujo tenerlo a él acá en la universidad. Así que bueno, Ben, muchas gracias por haber viajado 2 vuelos de 7 horas, o sea 14 horas para estar acá con nosotros.
Hello. Thanks for having me. I might just pull this out and walk around a little and kick and cuss a bit. But I want to start my speech off with an apology to all of you in the audience. Just really quick, let's get this out of the way. Or I can do this. Yeah. Oh, no. Oh, my gag. It ruined my gag. First, I just want to say I can't speak Spanish, and I apologize for you that today. So I'm going to be giving the talk in English. I do admire Spanish and love it quite a bit, so much so that I married a Spanish speaker. So I have a lot of respect for it, and I apologize that I'm unable to do that very effectively today. And I gave my talk what I hope was a Spanish language pun. I don't know how it worked or not. But anyway, my name is Ben Welsh, and I'm here from Los Angeles. I go by Pale Wire online, and that's where you can find me on Twitter and GitHub and all that kind of stuff. And I'm here from downtown Los Angeles, where I work at the Los Angeles Times, which is a daily print newspaper that you can see sort of illuminated there in the center below the skyline, and also a 24-hour website that includes a team that I work on that's called the Data Desk. And you might ask, what's a data desk? A data desk is a team of kind of reporters and programmers that's informally arranged in the newsroom. It's not any sort of massive effort. It's people who do data analysis for news stories offline using computer programming skills. It's people who make maps and interactive things and websites like Ryan talked to you about as well. It's people who work in our graphics department and who are web producers. And we all come together under sort of the banner of what we call the data desk to do what I would sort of broadly say is take databases, most frequently from public sources and the kind of open data things you're going to see a lot of at this conference, but not always, and try to convert those as the raw materials into... Oh, thank you. This work? Whoa. And try to convert those raw materials of the open data, the public data, the data that we create into a finished product of news. And in some cases, those can be front page stories, and others, it can take other forms. But that largely means that we write code. We're a group of people in a newsroom surrounded by editors and reporters and page designers who sit there and write computer code all day, right? I like to call us the house cats because we hang out in the office. We don't move outside the building as much as others, but we're still all part of the broader team of making news. And just because we know how to write in Python or JavaScript or HTML or all of those other things that you're all familiar with, that doesn't mean we forgot how to write English or we don't work on news stories or write them directly. For instance, this is a story that appeared, I think, 3 Sundays ago in the Los Angeles Times here on the right, written by one of my colleagues, Doug Smith, in partnership with 2 reporters, which is a data analysis that found that there's a list of probably hundreds of buildings in Los Angeles made out of a certain type of non-ductile concrete, it's called, that are likely to collapse if a major earthquake ever hits the center of the city, larger than the earthquake of 20 years ago in Northridge. And that series, which has sparked a lot of controversy and pushes to reform the building regulations in the city over the last few weeks, really all started with a nerd in his cubicle and a list and a database that they acquired, cleaned up, put a lot of love and attention into, and then went out and verified out in the world, did all sorts of truth checking, and then converted into this finished product, which was, a front page news story. right? And I'm going to show you a bunch of other examples just very quickly of things like that we do, not all of them news stories. And then I'm going to focus in on one of those projects, which was a crime database site that we made that I was asked to talk to about you guys. And we're going to kind of walk through that in depth, sort of how that site came up with and was built, and talk about it in detail. And then when I finish that, we'll be open to questions for anything you might want to ask regarding that or anything more broadly as well. Okay, so that's kind of what you're in for. Hope it doesn't sound too bad. All right, so just real quickly, sort of a tour of the data desk. Just like that front page story I showed you, we put a lot of effort into big projects, into investigative work based on data that doesn't always even look like data when it comes out. So here's a story that ran about a year ago in the Los Angeles Times, and it's about the toll of prescription drugs in America. Prescription drugs now kill more people, overdoses in the United States than do car fatalities, because there's been a huge uptick in the number of people who are addicted and overdose and take too many. And what our data analysis found was getting a small sample of several large counties in Southern California, analyzing it very closely, we were able to find that a very small number of doctors account for a very outsized number of overdose deaths. So you have a small number of irresponsible doctors, and they don't account for all of the deaths, but they account for a very large proportion. And that was a statistical finding that came out of really closely analyzing this public database that we found, that then ultimately was converted into a photography project in some sense, and profiles of the people who died, and a very sort of humanized story. But at its core, and if you were to read the whole thing, you would see that there's a really kind of hard-nutted data analysis in there as well. And that's what we're trying to do a lot of times, is bridge those two things. And a story like that had some great impact. You can see here on the right, our governor just a few weeks ago signed several new bills that will tighten the oversight of prescription drugs in California, and to hopefully identify these doctors who are irresponsible sooner before it goes too bad. Another recent example would be a big issue in sports in the United States is the long-lasting toll of playing our national pastime, professional football, where the number of brain injuries that people accrue as part of playing that sport that lasts them their whole life and often lead to early death. They're getting lots of attention in the media. There's lots of anecdotal and emotional and sort of first-hand coverage of this issue, and it's being pushed across almost all of major American media. And what we decided was to take a more data-driven look at that. We know that in the state of California, there was sort of a loophole in the workers' compensation law that allowed NFL players to make their injury claims there, even if they didn't play for a California team. And we were able to acquire that database via public records request, analyze it, and try to find something more insightful to tell our readers on the front page of the paper like you'd see here. But, it's not all just stories like that. Here's another recent story that was an analysis of the street quality in Los Angeles that took the form of a front page story by my colleague Ben Poston, but also of an interactive online map I worked on where people could zoom and click and check out the letter grades of the streets all across the city. Another big data thing we did in recent years was an analysis of teachers and how effective they are at raising their students' test scores, which took the form of front page stories, but also an online database that has a page for every teacher in the district, allowing parents, students, other teachers, administrators, really anyone in the public to access teacher by teacher the data that formed the basis for making those major claims that we made on the front page. Right? Another example is one I worked on, which is analyzing 911 response times in the city. Our fire department made an embarrassing admission that their statistics were all wrong and they didn't really know what they were. So we set out to analyze it ourselves, got the data, developed our own method, wrote a large series of stories, which resulted in front page stories like this, but also online maps that allow people to interact with the data. And that series has ultimately just now resulted in the fire chief being pushed out of office. But there's other things that aren't even stories, like election results maps for the presidential election recently in the United States, county by county, in my home state, Iowa, the most important state. And D3 graphics like this that are, which you can learn here later at the conference, where you make interactive graphics that run as a part of a story. Things that aren't even necessarily hard news stories. A list of the 101 best restaurants in Los Angeles, which, is the sort of thing in the United States every city's publication is going to run. Typically not thought of as a database, but really kind of is a database at its core. There's 101 entries. They all have a certain amount of set of things, a name, a location, a type of food that they serve, a photo associated with them. And so the process of assembling that data and building it into a website is something one of my colleagues, Anthony Pesci, put a lot of work into. Right? And also just sort of the standard interactive graphics that you see more and more of. They're intended to stand alone, independent of any story, as sort of a shareable, interesting, of the moment kind of graphic. This is how much money we pay Major League Baseball players in the United States by team. Right? And also things like snowfall-y, like long scrolling, pretty photo-like type things that are of the current vogue. Here's one we did over the last week. We also falls on our team to do things like that. So the type of work can range from that sort of deep dive investigative analysis I told you to sort of the cherry on top of a web presentation that requires a little more technical skill and freedom of movement with code than the base CMS, the base publishing system of our site allows. Right, and we also do things like we build little publishing tools outside the CMS. Let's say we want to quickly publish a document via Document Cloud and have it hosted on our site. We have little systems that allow you to do that, to make timelines, to make sortable tables, and that's the sort of process of software development where we're making little in-house tools to make quickly publishing something based on data easier to do. And a lot of that open source code that we develop as part of that process is on GitHub, which is a really great website. I'm assuming most people here know it. I also describe it as sort of Facebook for nerds, right? It's where you can go and be part of a social network that's built around a code, and the code that people are publishing as open source, or even the private projects that you publish in-house, you can host that way. And it's a great way to discover and contribute to open source projects. But you get the point, right? So that's kind of basically what we do more broadly. And all those range of things, and I'm happy to talk about any of those things individually or any questions you might have later. But when they set up the event, I was told that crime is an interesting topic and crime data is an interesting topic here in Buenos Aires and in Argentina at large, and so they was asked to talk a little bit about a website that we had developed a few years ago, which we call Crime LA, and what it is it's a crime mapping database system that takes the daily crime reports processed by our local police departments and maps them, analyzes them, and publishes them on the web for the public. And you can check it out right now if you have your computer up, or later if you want to, or at any time, at this URL, which is just maps.latimes.com/crime. Right, and it has a bunch of different kind of types of pages you might see. Here's a page about a crime. So over the last 3 years, there's been several 100,000 crimes recorded, and every one of them is in a database and comes out on a page not like this, which tells you where it was, what happened, or what was reported to have happened, who reported it, et cetera, et cetera. There's a page for more than 200 neighborhoods in the county of Los Angeles, so we've decided to kind of slice and dice the data and present it to our readers in sort of geographically recognizable areas that they know, rather than just throwing them on the map. So here's crimes in Highland Park, and you can slide that slider and go back in time, and the crimes will come on and go off, and you can see what's happening. It has like the most recent crimes, so here's like a list of the most recent crimes that would appear just below that map. But in addition to the list, it also provides some automated analysis that tells you here's the total, here's how it compares to the recent history, here's how it compares to the nearby neighbors of that neighborhood. And then in that analysis, it figures out, are there an unusual amount of crimes statistically in this neighborhood compared to what it typically sees? And if so, that could trigger something like an alert, and then we automatically publish with each data update a blog post. This is written entirely by a computer that says, hey, Los Angeles, here are all the neighborhoods that in the latest crime reports are experiencing an uptick for their history in crime, with a little map and tables and et cetera, et cetera. And those are kind of the short-term analysis it does. There's long-term analysis as well for each neighborhood, where over a longer period of time the crimes are totaled, they're ranked against other neighborhoods, it's split out by what types and shown over months, and that gives you a little broader context, which you could then say map the neighborhoods. The gray ones are where we still don't have data. You could map the neighborhoods based on their level of crime per capita, and you could rank them just like this and see which neighborhoods have the most violent crime. Okay, but so how did all this happen? How does a site like this come together? How could you yourself make something like it? And that's what I'm going to start to try to tell the story of now by rewinding back to how a site like that all got started. And it all started really when Meredith Artley, who used to be my boss, she now works at CNN, had hired a couple of us geeks onto the website, and she said, hey geeks, right, I want a crime map. And that's the sort of broad instruction you might get from an editor who's not particularly technical, but who's smart enough to hire technical people, which is, I know this is possible, other places do it, let's do it for our local area, and let's maybe do something better or different than what other people have already done, right? And so the instruction starts out broad like that, and we just went through a process where we started figuring out, like, well, okay, what would that take, and what form do we want to shape it into, right? And so a big structural problem that you have in Los Angeles is what I call kind of the bureaucratic terrain, which is LA County has like 10 million people, right? But in that big county of Los Angeles, there are 88 cities, the largest of which is Los Angeles City, which you've probably heard of, policed by the Los Angeles Police Department. But there's many other police departments that are independent that police smaller cities, and there's also a county sheriff's department that polices lots and lots of others, right? And so we knew that was going to be our big problem, is each of them is each individually collecting data and publishing data. If they're going to be our source, we're going to have to go to them, right, each individually, which is difficult and is probably not unlike an issue you might face with your regional estates as well, right? And maybe your cities too. It depends. So you get they're our source. And we also knew that our big goal for what we wanted to make, and I would encourage anyone making a crime map to set this as a goal, which is to be more than just like a million points on the map. And particularly at the time we were working on this, but even still so today, most crime mapping software, that's really what it is you get all the data from the police, you come up with a goofy icon for each of the different crime types, here's a picture of somebody with a ski mask on an icon, and here's a picture of a knife on an icon, maybe with some little blood coming off it, or something silly like that, and then you just throw them all on the map and you say, hey, you're welcome, go make sense of it, world. And I think that, as journalists, we should aspire to do more than just kind of throw it out there. We should aspire to throw it out there and shape it into something that, somebody who doesn't have as much time and isn't paid to do this, right, can just like quickly kind of learn things from it and see insights. And, one thing we wanted to do, like you saw in those examples, was to spot short-term trends. I mean, that's something people want to know about crime, is in the recent past, is there some unusual crime activity that I should know about if I live in this place or I know someone who lives there or I'm interested in it, right? And the second thing is long-term context, which is, okay, so let's say there have been a lot of crimes recently or not in this neighborhood, but is that usual? What is the typical level of crime over a long period of time in an area? And that's the sort of thing people want to know, one, about the area they live, but maybe two, about places they're considering moving, right? Or the places that they're interested in being active about, the level of police protection about, right? And then the other thing we wanted to do is, besides just throwing them on the map, was to shape them into geographic areas that people can relate to, right? And that's why we love the neighborhoods data. So where we have developed through a crowdsourcing process with our readers, because there are no official neighborhoods for the city of Los Angeles, we've developed our own set of neighborhoods that are cross-mapped with census data that allows us to take any data that's a point, cross-reference those two things, and then add it up and analyze it, and be able then to dish it out to our readers as well in that form, so that something like the number of aggravated assaults can not just be citywide. It can not just be, in Police District 6, which is what the cops might shape it as, right, which no human who's not a cop would recognize, but can be presented as, no, aggravated assaults downtown, right, in a geographic unit of analysis that's more recognizable to people. And we do that not just for crime. We did it for the pavement story that I showed you earlier. We did it for the fire department thing. We do it for the census data. We do it for all kinds of stuff. And there's probably something like that that you can use as well, too. And using some of the GIS tools that'll be discussed here at the conference, like CartoDB or PostGIS or whatever you like, Google Fusion tables, you can actually start to achieve that kind of point-in-polygon analysis that's necessary to aggregate point data into something that's more relatable. But okay, so those are our goals, and we know that we got all these departments, but how do we actually start on that road to get it? In the state of California, which is where Los Angeles is, there's a law, and it's a pretty good law. It's not a great law, but it's a pretty good law, and it's called the California Public Records Act. And it's sort of like, you've probably heard of FOIA, right, which is the federal United States law governing the United States federal government on the records it has to release to the public on request. Every U.S. state also has its own similar law, which governs the state government and local governments in the state. And ours is the California Public Records Law. And according to that law, and according to legal decisions that have happened afterwards, after it was passed, we have the right to the crime data. Yeah, right? So the cops, they got to give it to us. They got to give it to us. I can just write an email or a letter, and I can say, hey, coppers, give me the data, right? And then they're going to give me the data, and then I'm going to make a great map, and it's going to be awesome, right? But there's one problem. They have to give me the data after I make a request and after they have 10 days to respond to that request, which is written into the law. And then if 10 days wasn't enough, they're allowed to file for a 14-day extension and say, well, we're really busy, or your request was very difficult, so it's going to take us a little longer than 10 days. We need another 14. Then the 14 will go by, and I'll say, well, I'm counting weekends. And they'll say, no, we're not counting weekends. And I'll say, yeah, but the law says calendar days. Calendar days are weekends. And they'll say, huh? Or they won't respond. And then several more days will go by, and then I'll have to call somebody, and then it'll go on. And then I'll CC 8 people on an email, including their boss, and I'll be like, yeah, where's my request? And all that'll happen. And then, hey, I'll get the data, and it'll have been 2 months, right? And oh gosh, I asked for the last 6 months of data, but that was 2 months ago. Oh, gosh. And oh, what if I want another dump tomorrow? Do I have to file another request? Right? And so that's where the law really falls down for making something like a crime map where you want to update every single day with the latest crimes, is the law does not require the government to publish the data in an open format that regularly updates, that anyone can regularly access, which is the kind of thing you guys are all looking for when we say open data. The law just requires them to respond to my request within the rules and regulations that are set up. And so that was the big hurdle we faced, is that the police departments we were going for didn't have to give it to us in a way that we needed to build the site we wanted to build. They just had to give it to us in a way that the law required, which wasn't good enough, right? So that's where we were. We needed something that they didn't have to give us. So you sort of turn into beggars. And you think, well, okay, if there's 15 police departments and we go to all 15, that's going to take forever, right? And some of them are really behind the times. So how can we get the most bang for the buck? And the tactic that we kind of adopted to do that was we went to the 2 biggest ones, which is the Los Angeles Police Department, Joe Friday and all that, and the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, who are the 2 largest in the county. They're the 2 most advanced. They're the 2 biggest. They have LAPD is actually famous for its crime mapping that it uses for its own internal analysis, we're told. And they cover a huge section of the population and of the territory. And so we kind of decided, at the outset, let's just go after those 2 guys and let's try to get them on board. And so what that meant was setting up meetings with people who work there, the people who run their data, and sort of saying, hey, let's make this happen. It'll be a good thing for your goals, for our goals. Let's collaborate and kind of have it happen. And the Los Angeles Police Department responded this way. They said, well, we don't really trust everybody to give this data, to put it out open. But you guys are the newspaper, and you're asking really nice, and your editor came, and it's really friendly. And, we like data, we're into it, and we want to look like we're really advanced and pushing the envelope and all that stuff. So we'll do it, but only you can have the data, right? Not in the words of our former chief, not someone in their underwear, right? Which in the United States is our image for a blogger for some reason. The blogger is always described as being in his underwear or her underwear, in the basement, right, alone. But that was the actual image he used. And so they said, yeah, we'll give it to you. And it'll come like this, and it'll only be for the last 6 months because we have our own Los Angeles Police Department interpretation of the California Public Records Act, which says it only applies to contemporaneous records, which we define as the last 6 months. So even though you think you get all the data, we actually say, no, it's probably just the last 6 months, but we'll give it to you in this feed that you like. So are you going to complain? And we said, no, we won't complain, we'll take it. And they set up the feed. And I wrote the code that goes in every night and starts pulling it out. The Sheriff's Department, not as technically advanced or famous about their data analysis at the LAPD, took what I think was a more enlightened position, and they said, you know what, this is going to take us a few months to make this happen. It can't happen right away. But if we're going to do the work, why should we do the work just for you? We get requests for this kind of thing all the time. Let's instead write the code that'll publish our file up to our Sheriff's Department website as a CSV, a simple spreadsheet format that anybody can go get, and then Ben, you can go write your code to put that in, and then the next person who shows up and asks me for the data, I can just point them to that link and not do any work and take a long lunch. I said, hey, that's a pretty good idea. And so the Sheriff's Department took that different approach, right? And then my job became, as the nerd, as the house cat, was to sit in my little cubicle and write the code that sucks in those data files every day and starts looking at them, right? But a really important thing to remember is, you don't want to be, when you're working with government data, you don't want to be, we all want to be data journalists, right? And it's this great term, it's now in vogue, I love it, we're data journalists. Be a data journalist, don't be a data stenographer. Right, so do you guys know what that's? So a stenographer is the person who sits in court and just retypes everything everybody says, no matter how stupid it is, right? And don't be that type of person. When you get those data feeds from the government, you got to look at them skeptically, critically, analyze them before you choose to republish them. Otherwise, you'll just be a stenographer to what that data is saying, good, bad, or ugly. And what I discovered, looking at those files, much to my surprise, and actually my frustration, because I wanted to make a website, was that the LAPD's data, that file from the big experts, right, that was published in the FTP for Just For Me, when I took all those rows and rows of data, and I did a really complex data mining operation, which is called, addition, right? I just added them all up. I said, okay, so they say there's been this many over the last 6 months, and this is where they say it's happened, and this is how many they were, and I can really drill down, and I could map it and do all this analysis. But when I just added it up, I saw that, hey, this isn't the same numbers that they report to the FBI. So under our federal system, the LAPD is required to give big aggregate totals to the federal government, to our federal law enforcement agency, which is called the FBI. And that is under this goofy system that's called UCR, for Uniform Crime Reports, right? You've maybe heard of J. Edgar Hoover. He was sort of the tyrant-like figure that ran the FBI, but one good thing that came out of that was data standards. And so all the local police departments are required to report their totals up to the federal government in what's called UCR. And I just found that they didn't equal each other. Man, that was really weird, right? And what I also found is that in the same time I'm racing to do this, build this website, the LAPD has hired a private contractor to build their own website. And they use the same file. Gee, that's weird. So what that then resulted in was a front page story in the Los Angeles Times, which told people what that weird situation ended up being, which is that the LAPD is, one, giving us a file, two, paying someone else to make a map for you to read, right, that's missing nearly half of all the crimes that actually occurred in that year. Right? And so this was something that just sort of accidentally came out of building the website. It wasn't an investigation we set out to do, but just by taking that government data release and just doing basic integrity checks on it, we found a news story. And it, it's front page, wow, that's fun, my name's in the paper, my mom's really proud. My mom doesn't want to look at the websites, she doesn't care. But when your name's in the paper, mom's proud. But unfortunately, that kind of short-circuited this like longer journey we had been on to build a website. We can't just like, now that we know it's wrong, which Jesus Christ, we can't like turn it into a website. That would be irresponsible. And the LAPD police chief, he was a very smooth operator, thanked us for our investigation, said, of course, this is a problem. We will pull down the site, which was the right thing to do, and we will fix the data file to the LA Times. And obviously, they couldn't do that overnight. They fired the contractor. Some time went by. I worked on other projects. This thing stood around, and we're over a year past that first slide when Meredith Artley said, we want a crime map, right? Just in the acquisition phrase. But ultimately, we get a file again from the LAPD, and I'm back in my cubicle, taking the files from both the departments, and they each have their own data standards, their own like column names, their own things they'll give me or won't give me. And I'm thinking, well, how am I going to build one map for everybody out of these different data sources? Well, there's this FBI system, which can be our standard. So part of the code and the database that you build sucks in these two files every day, standardizes them according to this federal thing of the 8 major crime types, and what they call them in the U.S., and then puts that into like a consolidated LA Times kind of like data table of all the crimes, right? And then you sort of set up a little web server connected to that, and you're writing even more code, and then you start writing a lot of math. So we have the big table that has all the crime reports, but man, we want to slice them and dice them by neighborhood. We want to do these long-term, short-term statistics, and what that requires is in your code, as each day's data file gets loaded, having it calculate and then ultimately publish, but first calculate those statistics that we use on the pages I showed you earlier, right? And so just to walk through what those stats are really shortly, it's like, so our broad goal is to give you this broad context about, what is violent crime like in Hollywood, in Echo Park, in Venice, in downtown, for all the neighborhoods as a whole where we have crime data. And so you have these 4 of the 8 major crimes by the FBI. 4 of them are violent: homicide, aggravated assault, robbery, and rape. And you sort of bundle them up into what we call our sort of violent crimes group or basket, which is the same thing the FBI does. So again, we're using their federal standard. We're not out there inventing anything crazy, right? You then map all of those, so each crime has a point related to it, and you have the computer using geometry basically, just sort of pull out of the database all the violent crimes over, say, 6 months for each of the 200 plus neighborhoods, and now you have a number, right, for each one. You could rank that and just do the counts, but you have an issue, which is not all neighborhoods are created equal. Some are bigger than others, so like a very simple per capita statistic allows us to give you the violent crime rate in each of those neighborhoods. And we're able to do that because those neighborhoods that I told you about earlier, the intel inside of the neighborhoods isn't that we drew the lines just right so everybody agrees and they're beautiful and there's no contention about the borders. No, what the great thing about the neighborhoods is it's connected to our U.S. Census data. So we actually know for these sub-city areas that we've defined what their populations are. Or if you just go out and start drawing neighborhoods, it could be totally disconnected from your census information. So we sort of use the census blocks, is what they're called in the United States, these areas defined by the census that are very small. We sort of use them like Legos, right, to sort of put together the neighborhoods and then maybe cut them in half and split the population between 2. And then at the end, that geographic boundary of the neighborhood we have has all this rich metadata that comes from our census associated with us. And a really simple but powerful thing that allows you to do is something like this, which is just to say, for this neighborhood, for downtown LA, this thing that you recognize and can talk about and makes total sense, right? Here's the violent crime rate. And that gives you a really powerful way to show and talk about lots of things. Like in the LAFD, in the fire department 911 thing I showed you earlier, it turned out the slowest neighborhood, the last neighborhood, Bel Air, has the highest income neighborhood. And that allows you to not just show something interesting to people, but to say it to them in a way that anybody can understand or that you can write on the front page of the newspaper. The richest neighborhoods have the slowest 911 response. You know what I mean? And it's because you've built up this foundation of geographic data linked to rich metadata that you're able to ultimately make that synthesis and say something that your mom can understand, or that the guy 2 beers in at the bar can understand, or whatever. Or even your graphics editor, no. And then we essentially repeated the exact same thing with property crimes as well. And that's how we got the sort of broad context. And that also allows you to make maps like this and those rankings I showed you and whatever. But then we also wanted to get at the newsiness of short-term crime and things that are happening recently, but we wanted to do it in a statistically sound way. So again, let's say I want to know what neighborhoods are having an unusual amount of violent crime like now, or like in the last week, because that's news, right? That's a lot of work, though. We don't have enough reporters to like go out to all the neighborhoods and talk to people and figure that out, but this can help. So again, you take all the violent crimes, you slice them up by the neighborhood, but this time, instead of over the last 6 months, you look over the most recent 7 days that you have available, which we defined as sort of our recent period, which is just a statistical decision we made. It's totally debatable. We then compared that most recent week to the weekly average in that neighborhood over the last 3 months. So in downtown, there's been this many crimes per week over the last 3 months, and here's how many have been in the last 7 days. What is the most recent week's deviation from that weekly average, right, is a statistic you can calculate. We calculated that, so then that gives you another number, and then we editorially defined a certain standard deviation and a certain absolute number of crimes. It has to deviate this much from the mean, and it has to be at least 3 crimes for it to qualify for what we call our alerts, right? And so if the neighborhood has, relative to its own past, experienced a standard deviation above this or that and met the standard, alert, into the blog post, up and out. So there's a little alert flag that'll appear on the page. You can see it explained in here, and then it goes into the blog post as well. And the end product is something we hope is really simple for people to get, which is like, hey, check it out. Here's a neighborhood that's having more crime than usual, right? And maybe if it's really crazy, a reporter would look into it or whatever. But behind that thing that we're trying to make that's easy to understand is just sort of a basic statistical algorithm or equation or whatever you want to call it, where we've defined strictly the rules of what we're going to call news. And so we're taking that kind of news judgment and we're converting it into computer code and then running it over the moving data stream that comes in every day from these police departments. Right? And so that all then happens. So, every night there's a cron script, to pull the 2 files, standardize them, stuff them in one database, get them in the web server, then the web server does all this math down here that I was telling you about, and then that happens, and then finally, you actually have to make something for people to use out on the internet, right, after you've done all that. And we do all that development in-house too, and we use kind of a common stack of tools, very similar, I think, to the ones they use at the Texas Tribune, that includes at its core a PostGIS database, which is, are you guys familiar with it? It's a modification of the common open source Postgres database that allows you to do geometry on it. So you can ask a database, give me all the records where the name field equals Ben, right? But with a PostGIS database, you can say, give me all the records that are near or within a certain boundary of this point, or who fall within this neighborhood. And so it allows you to write that kind of SQL database interactions with a geometric questions as opposed just to strict semantic questions. And it's very popular, if you've used Instagram, you've used PostGIS, right? So the same tools that we use to make news was used to make those people billionaires. And exact same software, exact same tools, they just used it for a different purpose. And it's used on a lot of things. And then on top of that is the application layer where all the rules of what gets pulled out where to put on what pages get written. And that we also do in Python and Django. There's sort of the web server and all the caching. Like that's the part where all my stress is like right there in that third layer where you sort of make sure that it can manage all the web traffic you're going to get in a way that doesn't crash. And then finally there's the actual user interface for the people, which we just use basic common stuff that you're all familiar with, HTML, JavaScript, and a number of JavaScript libraries for mapping and other things that make it easier. I'd really recommend Leaflet, which has just sort of blown out the field in the last couple years as a JavaScript mapping tool. And so that's how we get it from the server to the user. And that's how you end up on a page like this, which again is the home page that we started of at maps.latimes.com/crime, where you can go, and the basic thing on the page is, guess what, the neighborhoods that have most recently had an alert. But if you hover on a neighborhood, click it, you'll get that neighborhood's report. You can search your address, it'll jump you to that neighborhood's page, where you'll get all the information that we talked about and showed earlier. And so also results in a front page story where we say, yeah, we now have a crime map. Here's a big long-term thing. You should go check it out, right? Here's the email I get every morning that tells me that, yes, everything went A-OK, and the crime data has published and come in. There's a number of diagnostic screens that kind of give me a little more information about what exactly got loaded and what happened, or if something went wrong that I need to go work on it. But that's kind of part of the process, is you get these little reports. And then those automated blog posts get written. And then my favorite thing is then using this database to not just allow someone to go look up data because they're curious, or to provide kind of a little more contextual analysis for somebody who's house hunting, but to also really try to better inform the day-to-day crime coverage that we do in the paper. I mean, I'm not an expert on Argentine media, but I would bet that you have some of the same things happen that happen in the United States, which is that a small number of spectacular crimes tend to get, exponentially more attention than the run-of-the-mill things that happen that'll be in a database like this. And people like to attach their own storylines to what those crimes mean and what they tell you about the places where they are, that are based on folklore and previous big things like this that have happened or whatever, and often aren't supported by a lot of empirical evidence, right? And so what really gets me excited is when a crime happens and we're able to, using the database the same day that the crime happens or very shortly thereafter, provide more context to our readers about what that means. So if you're familiar with the neighborhood of Hollywood, which is where the Hollywood Walk of Fame is, right? If you've ever been there, it's not really that nice. And it is, there's a stabbing there and a killing in recent times that got tons and tons of attention. And what we were able to do, they're going to write this front page story anyway. You know what I mean? Your editors and reporters, they're going to write it. But you can then insert yourself into that process and contribute a couple of paragraphs that say, well, here's the actual long-term rates, which in this case it actually was high, right? This crime does represent a significant amount of violent crime that happens in that neighborhood. Or you could try to challenge that internally. And we've done that on a couple other occasions as well, where the police like to flood the zone and kind of tell people that either this neighborhood, they try to tell their own story using the statistics, right? So statistics are things that the government uses to tell stories, and you can, one, validate or maybe challenge those stories when you're able to do your own independent analysis. And crime is a really great example of that I don't think it's done enough, that we don't use the data to really step into those really changing stories. And I think that we could definitely do a better job of it, but to me, that's what's really exciting, is being able to get beyond just putting it out there and to really challenge those top-line narratives in the media. Okay, yeah, blah, 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 right? So all this was based on and started with my friend, the California Public Records Act, and our ability and the goodwill of our police departments to ultimately participate, right? Now, I know not everybody has that, and I personally don't know the situation in Buenos Aires. I mean, please someone tell me afterwards, or we could talk about it, I'd be happy. But I know in many places, that's not the case. One, you don't have the law on your side. Two, you don't have the administrators on your side, or either or, and you're kind of screwed, right? So, I mean, remember I started with this. We take these databases and turn them into news, and that's primarily what we do and what people like us do, but it's not all we do. Right? There's a different approach you can take in more difficult situations, and this is kind of flip, but it's true. Instead of turning the database into news, you turn the news into a database, right? Like starting from scratch. And if you think about it, there's lots of projects that you see like that. And one that we do that's related to crime that is exactly that is a separate crime site that we keep, and actually a blog that's called the Homicide Report. And it's been around about 5 years, and it records each and every person who is killed by another person in Los Angeles County. And here's, you can check it out if you want to see it at projects.latimes.com/homicide. That map looked a little old, I do admit, but I promise you the site will in the next month have a total facelift and be a lot cooler. but this is what it currently is right there, and it's still a really great and very informative site. And it includes, a page, a blog post for each and every person who's died. But a blog post is really just a blob of text. And what you can do when you stop approaching news as a blob of text and start thinking about everything critically more as data is you can say in that death, Michael Jackson, right, which happened in the city, right, there's more than just the blob of text. There's the name of the person who died. There's the photograph of that person. There's their date of birth and their age. There's the date that they died. We can take that point of the address and we can convert that into our neighborhood using the system. There's his gender, there's how he died, there's the police involved, there's his ethnicity, there's where he died, and there's other things we actually collect too. And so you could take that and you could structure the story, right? And you can see you can do the same thing, not just for celebrities and front page deaths, but for, here's someone who died recently, for someone few people are familiar with, and, really anyone. And you can start taking that same structured approach to a lot of different people. And we take that to really everyone. And so we have a database that we built from really nothing, right? From the scraps of public records and things that go out that we're able to assemble that go into a database system that's behind the website where all of that structured information is sort of put in and refined and grown and nurtured over time. And then once you have a database like that, you're able to, one, quickly build through a templating system a blog and a page for every person, right, which we just saw, but also do all kinds of analysis. So here's the neighborhood where I live. See, this is the best house shopping website, right there. And so, so you can see over the last 5 years or whatever, here's all the people that have died. We can do the same per capita rates. You can see the most recent. You can, when you're writing the blog post about someone who died, say this person died in downtown and this neighborhood has had this many. It can be written right into the newspaper. The most recent one was here or there, or there hasn't been a homicide in the neighborhood where this one occurred in the last 6 years. You can provide that kind of context instantly to new crimes, and you can provide a lot of really broad, long-term context to readers about the shape of something over a long period of time, which we were able to do here using some data from a previous project to show the long-term decline in homicides in Los Angeles, which results in a front page story. Right, and another example of this isn't just us, and we were talking about this yesterday, is the drug war in Mexico. So I really think that, one of the things that's helped reframe the drug war in Mexico as strictly a law enforcement story or as a story about who's the coolest narco or whatever has been the effort by the media, primarily in Mexico, to document the toll, the regular people, people involved, people not involved, all the people who are dying as part of this. And that's really a database building project, right, where data wasn't available, that a lot of different people in the media and in the government there have done, particularly La Reforma. And so this is a map that's several years old. The actual number now is much, much higher than this. This is a map from 2009, but this is where we were able to take that structured data of all the deaths related to the drug war that La Reforma had collected via the Transborder Institute, which is a great group, and we were able to map over time and geographically and give a big number for people about the human toll of this war, right? And we were only able to do that because somebody made a database where there wasn't one, right? And they took the news and they built it slowly over time, and that became the raw materials, not just for us, but for everyone in the media and in the government to have real data. And so I guess the point of telling this little fable is just to get at, if you don't have the open data, it can really limit you a lot, but there's ways to work around it, and what's necessary is, one, focus and drive to get at something that's important, and lots of wherewithal to make it happen and to build those systems. And if that's the situation you're in, I think that the model in America of the homicide database, which not just we do, but it's done in Washington, D.C., in Chicago, in many other cities, is something that could be effective where you are too. And there's actually some people who try to sell software that does this. I won't get into that whole thing, but I think that if it's not being done here and you're concerned about homicides, I think that's one thing that's happening in the United States that I would encourage you to think about, okay? And so, that's the end of my little spiel, right? And I'm happy to talk about this, about anything else, about any other questions you got. Just want to say quick off, you can find our major projects at datadesk.latimes.com. You can follow all the crap we put out at LAT Datadesk on Twitter, and you can check out our code and point out all our bugs, please, on GitHub. Okay? And so that's it.
My main fear when I'm using databases is that you miss out on the difficulties that you had finding that information when you split the person that's collecting the information, the subjectivity to it, what difficulties you had in encountering that information. And you kind of lose the contact between the person using it and the person collecting it. How do you work to avoid that happening, to make numbers not be absolute numbers, to see what was the exception to the...
How do you keep from dehumanizing them, turning them into like just another number kind of thing?
Well, with numbers, you just don't get the feel if that information is absolutely accurate or it's just almost accurate, or if there was an exception or something funny you found when you were doing the numbers, but it's really not there.
We would leave it out. So our kind of policy is if it's not verified, if it's not from an official source or the people directly involved with the person or something that's verifiable, we'll just omit it, right? And so there's some cases where you don't have complete data about a lot of the people, right? And so it's sort of us hodgepodge assembling from the official sources that do exist and from our own work in the field to build the database. And so there's a good number of people about which there's very sketchy information, right? But we also have a full-time reporter who works on the homicide report, and her job is to go out and interview people and talk to people and get the photographs and then write stories about a smaller number that we're able to do that amount of research. And so the reality is that for most people who are killed or die in these circumstances, they don't get all that attention because we don't have all the resources, right? But we try to direct it where we can to, one, make sure that there's a bare minimum amount of information about everybody, which otherwise does not exist, right? You know what I mean? They're not counted. They really aren't, right? They're not, particularly in Los Angeles, which is a really big city, which even though it's down, there's still a lot of homicides. Only a small number are ever going to be a brief in the newspaper or make the local news, right? They would otherwise go unmentioned. And so even in the cases where you have very little, many of the people close to the victim are often very appreciative just that there's something, right? We also provide comments associated with each post that's generated so that people are able to have conversations, many of them very frank, on those pages. And so I wish we could do more, and I wish we could get more, but we can't. And with the resources we have, we really have the database developer who does the coding that is a big capital investment that builds a system that can work for a while without them working on it every day, and then that reporter who kind of also is inputting things, collecting things, writing stories for the paper, for the web as well, that are more narrative, more traditional stories, right? That someone who's not into numbers could relate to.
¿Alguna otra pregunta?
Bueno, mi pregunta tiene que ver con, hace un par de años un político argentino presentó un mapa del delito, pero no tuvo mucha repercusión porque la gente no cooperaba en el aporte de datos.
We will translate it to you.
Okay, I got a little bit, but
En la otra parte del aspecto que tiene que ver con este planteo, a lo que quiero llegar es, sobre todo la exposición que hizo, es ¿qué hay de la parte de los ciudadanos en el aporte, o si hay algún aplicativo donde desde los teléfonos celulares se pueda dar más reportes? Si hay alguna investigación en eso o cómo es la cultura en todo caso.
Do you have something regarding crowdsourcing data with cell phones on crime data with your maps? Tu pregunta sería si están usando algo de información de reporte de ciudadanos.
No, me refiero a toda esta investigación que le está mostrando, es lo que se hace como reportero de alguna forma.
Pero ellos lo están tomando de información de la policía. They are getting their information from police department.
Sí, pero muchas veces no se llegan a denunciar, o por lo menos en nuestra cultura no se llegan a denunciar. Entonces quiero saber, desde los ciudadanos, si hay alguna posibilidad de mayor aporte a esos datos, ¿no?
Okay, I understand. Here in Argentina, some crimes are not reported to the police.
Sure.
So he's asking if you have another way of getting information besides police reports to add to your map.
We don't have any sophisticated whiz-bang like technology that makes that easier, but I think that that's a really, really good thing to keep in mind when you're analyzing crime data, is no matter where you are, there's an undercount because of the people who don't report, right, which is probably a very, very large number of crimes. And there's also what I call politely attrition, the number of people who are frustrated in their process to make a crime report and ultimately just don't. You know what I mean? They're making a call to the police department and they get frustrated with dealing with someone and it just never comes together. And so I think it's important to keep in mind that there's a really big number of uncounted crimes out there, and I don't have the solution to that problem. I think that making a system where people can anonymously report crime, perhaps, or where they can. Where it's easier for them to report it than it currently is with the police are potential fixes for that. I think that, police IT, in a place where police want to get those reports, information technology for the police department is a potential fix for that. Why do you have to get on the phone and go through an interview over the phone to make this report to the police? Couldn't you yourself enter basic information into a form and then be contacted as a verification and speed up that process to reduce the attrition? But, this is a huge problem, particularly with crimes against women. I mean, we know this with domestic abuse and rapes, that there's, women are, in an abusive relationship and they're afraid to report because of the consequences or for many other reasons. But, I don't need to explain it. And I don't have the solution. I don't. But we should all recognize, particularly when we're describing these statistics, that that's a reality. And we shouldn't present them as something they aren't. Homicides are a little different. It's more difficult to hide the body. Those sort of things tend to get counted. Though it depends where you live, I suppose. But it's a huge problem.
¿Otra pregunta? El micrófono, ¿te puedes acercar? Si alguien tiene otra pregunta, podemos hacer 2 preguntas más. We're going to take 2 more questions. Sí.
¿Qué tal? Mi pregunta es sencilla. ¿Cómo es la evolución de los datos? Supongamos que hay un asesinato, se lo informa a la policía, pero resulta que después evoluciona la investigación y fue un suicidio, o fue un atentado, o fue bajo otras causas. ¿Cómo actualizan esa información? ¿Lo llevan a la actualización?
What happens if a crime has been reported as one kind of crime, but then during the evolution of the investigation, it's discovered that has been another type of crime? How you update your database?
Right. So this is one of the trickier things of getting a system like this going, is managing amendments or changes to existing records and or the deletion, like if they decide it's not a crime and they remove it, or additions of new ones, right? And in the actual code writing process and in getting the data system set up at the outset, you need to be really careful and responsible about how you do it. So the way it works is each of the 2 departments I get it from managed it kind of slightly differently. So the LAPD, remember their little 6-month thing that they're very fond of? They only want to give me the last 6 months. So every day the file updates and it's sliced from their database of every date in the last 6 months. And it has a unique ID, right? I pull the similar time period from my database and I evaluate each record looking for amendments in any field, right? That's part of the code that does the load. And then if there's an amendment, it changes the record, and it also logs each version as well. We don't publish that, but privately in the database, it's logging every version of the individual records. And so we're able to check within that 6 months. Though, because they have that 6-month rule on their side, if a crime older than 6 months is amended, I don't get it, right? And it's not in our crime site. And it's for that reason that when we calculate our long-term statistics for the rankings, we use a 6-month period. Because it's only within that 6 months that I can, it's probably a very small number that change, but I don't know. And since I don't know, I'm not going to pretend I do, right? And so that's why we worked on that thing. Now the Sheriff's Department, though they don't have the reputation, do a smarter thing. When they give me the daily slice, they give me all amendments in the last 6 months. So rather than filtering on the crime date, they're filtering on the edited date that their database keeps every time there's a change. And so that allows me to be more, certain that you're getting it. But in my code, I have to make sure that I do all those changes. Otherwise, my data is going to get out of date and be wrong. There's also a process for removing crimes that have been deleted. And if a crime has been deleted, I check it in the database. We keep the record. We actually keep it on the map, and you can click on it, and it'll say deleted. And then we'll explain to you that the police have deleted this crime. But we will omit it from the statistics, right? So when we calculate the numbers, we won't count it, but we'll still show it to you so you don't like come to our site one day, see a crime, and come back, and then it's gone and think that we're playing some game. You know what I mean? We're just going to be transparent about it got deleted. And that's a real pain in the butt. You have to write a lot of code. But it's worth doing.
¿Otra pregunta? Sí, se pasan el micrófono, por favor.
Hi. Do you have like a system to test the accuracy of the information that you receive, even if it's from a government agency? How do you know to trust that that information is accurate?
Sort of broadly, as opposed to just the crime data? Yeah. So broadly, there's a couple, things you can do that are just kind of, they're not even really tricks. It's just like basic stuff that, people call integrity tests or whatever. To me, the most basic thing is if you're getting line-by-line data that's provided to you by a source, and they themselves publish some total somewhere or add it up somewhere, can you recreate the total that they've made? And I almost, if I can find that, that will always be my first goal, is to say, can I recreate the analysis that they themselves have done? Doesn't mean their analysis is right, you know what I mean? But it means you understand how they do what they do and how they get there. And then if it does match, you got a pretty good sense you're on track with them. And if it doesn't match, you get to ask some really interesting questions. Why is this? And then that process, you'll learn a lot, and there's usually only a small number of people in the government, agency that actually know how that happens. And once you get to talk to one of them, you can ask them all kinds of questions, you can learn all kinds of stuff, and you're able to kind of get somewhere. So to me, it's just like adding it up. Is, even like just the total number of rows, you know what I mean? It's not like you're doing anything fancy. Like, do I have the same number of rows that they do? If they're omitting things, which people often are for different reasons, omitting things from analysis, you got to figure out what those are, right? And so like what I discovered looking at the fire department database and a lot of their problems is they were omitting different things at different times and they didn't know why. Because different people were doing it and it wasn't standardized, and we were really pressing them on it, writing all these stories, and then I got one of the memos that they wrote in that time period that we were pressuring them, and the memo about how to use the database said, what do we exclude, ? You know what I mean? And so don't always assume that there's really like a system. The people at the government who generate this data, they're people just like you. They have, often deadlines just like you. And people kludge stuff. You know what I mean? Numbers get kludged sometimes, particularly when it's not, though Argentina may be an exception, particularly when it's not like the really high-level economic data that everyone is very closely watching, right? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
¿Alguna otra? Dejamos acá. La última.
Do you guys write about what works, what are the best practices when a place where the crime goes down in a place where you reported high crime rates before?
Like sort of a good news kind of story, like on what works. Probably not as much as we should. You know what I mean? The reality about crime, and this is probably my opinion, but crime in the United States is going down over a really long-term period, according to official crime reports. You know what I mean? Like way down. You know what I mean? You saw that story with 300 homicides. It was over 1,000, like in the 90s. And so that's the big long-term story about crime data in the United States. And I think that the media in the U.S. covers that a lot because politicians talk about it a lot, police chiefs talk about it a lot. It is remarkable. And that kind of big picture, like good news story about crime going down is very, very commonly told in the U.S. media. However, why? Right? Like, why is the crime going down is a debated thing. And that, the mayor is going to tell you it's because he and the police chief are such great mayors and police chiefs, right? And they've reformed the police department to be more enlightened and da-da-da-da-da. Well, okay, that may be true, but major crime is going down in every city in the United States, and you're not mayor everywhere. And that mayor in that other town, he's in jail, so, he wasn't a very good mayor, right? So there's some structural things happening in at least the U.S. that are deeper, you know what I mean, than like one mayor or one approach to policing that are happening. And in a lot of different ways we try to get at that. We've used our data to do a couple stories like about areas within high crime neighborhoods that have lots of crime, smaller like sub-neighborhood, like block areas that have like next to none, and like why is that? And we've gone and done stories about a couple places like that to see what is that place like that leads to that happening, right? And there's some reasons, but I think that the really big ticket question in the U.S. about why crime is going down is still to be answered, and maybe can't be answered, via some mix of economics and sociology and politics that kind of leads to it all. There's one person who wrote a controversial magazine article a few months ago claiming it's the reduction in lead in paint. There's less lead paint in poor neighborhoods, and so fewer people have lead poisoning, and lead poisoning leads to all this other stuff. You know what I mean? That's a theory, but how do you test it? How do we ever sort this out? I don't know if we'll really ever know the answer.
Thank you, Ben.